I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to explore the low mid-range of a mix. Now the low mid-range is kind of the engine room of your track. It's where a lot of energy comes from. It's not bass, it's not the super low frequency content, and equally it's not where the shiny, exciting stuff happens either. It's kind of, as I say, the engine room. It's the bit where we get lots of power, but potentially problems as well. So in this video, we're going to explore what the low mid-range is, why it's massively important to your mix, but why we just need to be a little bit cautious when it comes to working out which instruments are going to be active in that frequency area and which are maybe going to benefit from being a little attenuated or pulled back in that area. Let's just listen to this track that I've made. So of course, as we know, mixing is all about context. One sound can sound great when paired with other instruments, and it can sound a bit bloated or a bit shiny or a bit sort of subby in another context when it's paired with other instruments. So what we've got here is a whole group of sounds within this track which might, in a different context, be absolutely fine, but when used in this combination is just making the low mid-range a bit inflated and a bit overblown. Now, before we go any further, let's just find out exactly which frequency area I'm talking about. What I'm going to do is to put FabFilter's Pro Q3 on this track, and the reason I'm selecting this particular EQ plugin is because it allows me obviously to make a sort of selection from a frequency choice point of view, but what I can do is to press this little headphone button, and what that does is to solo this particular band of frequencies, and what we can do is to narrow in on it and just find out what I mean by the low mid-range. Let's just have a listen. Okay, so when solo like that, this band of frequencies sounds horrible. It sounds really resonant and really overdriven. And of course, depending on the room in which you're listening to, that will either sound a bit thin and strange, or it'll sound, yeah, resonant and a little bit honky. So what we're looking to do here is to sort of try and make sure that we're not overloading this frequency area whilst at the same time recognizing how much power it brings to a mix. And to show you what I mean, what I'm actually going to do is to fix at this frequency. This is 112.5 hertz. And I'm going to just bring down the volume pretty significantly here. I'm going to take it down by about 5 or 6 dB. And what we're going to do is just listen to exactly the same mix, but with this frequency band attenuated enough that we're sort of taking the engine room out. We're basically saying, okay, we want all of that quieter. Let's just see what we're left with. Okay, so two pretty extreme ways of looking at the same frequency band. When we lose it, we just get this slightly oddly ghostly kind of effect. We still have all of the low stuff, all of the bass is still there, but it feels completely detached from all of this fizzy energy that's happening on top. Similarly, the moment we increase that band and really push those frequencies in terms of their volume, we get this massively overblown effect where it just sort of feels like everything's, yeah, not in any way under control. So let's take this EQ out altogether. I'm going to leave it in place, but we're not going to address this problem by simply EQing the output channel. What I want to do instead is to appraise each of the elements within the mix and to find out which ones are benefiting from having low mid-range and which ones maybe we could squeeze a bit of that frequency content out of in order to make sure that this problem is rectified before the output rather than only at that stage. So let's have a listen. Firstly, what I've got is this sort of solo Tycho's part. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an EQ, that same EQ, on all of these tracks individually just to see what's happening in the low mid-range overall. Okay, so what we get is this very hummy quality. That sound is a significant contributor to the slightly overblown nature of that sound in the mix overall. We're going to leave it for now, but you can see that I've kind of marked the center of that frequency band. Let's come down to the next sound. Okay, so this sound is much less problematic. And what this combination of these two instruments combined would show us is that if we simply decided to try and fix this problem at the output stage, this sound here would lose as a result of making that decision. Because whilst that frequency band is present in this sound, it's not a problem in this sound. The activity in this sound is a little higher, it's a little brighter, it's a little more trebly. And as a result of attenuating the output alone, this sound would get weaker as a result because we'd be taking frequency content out of it when we don't really need to. This sound is not really a problem in the same way that the previous one is. Now let's have a look at the next track and see what it's doing. Again, what I'm going to do is to set up the Pro Q3 and we'll have a listen to this one and have a look at what its frequency footprint is. So this sound is interesting. Its main frequency area is lower than is true in the solo taikos. So again, I've marked the kind of middle of this sound and we're at 80 Hertz here instead. So what I'm starting to think is that this sound can kind of be the base foundation for the percussion language of this track. And it's going to be underpinning things. And what we could do would be to scoop some low mid-range out of this, but make sure we don't lose any bass. Whereas in the first sound, what we could do would be to sort of say, okay, well, actually what we're going to do there is make sure the low mids aren't overwhelming, but maybe what we might do is to lose the bass out of that sound to make room for this sound and lose a little bit of low mid-range out of this sound in order to make sure that the relationship with those two things isn't conflicting. Let's keep going. We've got one more sound that we're going to look at in terms of the percussion. Again, same thing as before. Let's put a Pro Q3 on it and let's just have a listen to the way that it sounds. Okay, so here we've probably got the most expansive sound within the percussion for this particular track. We've got a lot of low end in it. We've got quite a lot of low mid-range, but we've also got some sort of sparkle that's coming from the sort of top of those notes, the sort of more drum skin end of things where those drums are being hit. We're getting a lot of power there too. So let's start with this sound. What I'm going to do is to think about low mid-range and bass together. Which sounds do I want to have be bassy? Which ones do I want to be providing the low mid-range energy? And how are we going to form a relationship between those things? Okay, so what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to say the taiko part that's above is going to be the loudest thing that's going to be bassy. That's going to be the bottom end of my mix. And what I'm going to do is to make some space above that for the other instruments. And what that means is that for this sound, what I'm going to do is to start by creating a bit of a low cut on this sound. I'm going to say, right, this sound isn't going to be quite as bassy, and I'm going to make a hole down here at the bottom where the taikos can go. What I'm going to do is to attenuate in and around this mid-range, this low mid-range area. I'm holding down Command as I adjust the band of this frequency, and what that's doing is changing the band width. So in other words, I'm able to make a sort of more surgical choice in terms of how wide that band is. We can move that in a moment just to create a little bit of a space in the low mid-range for this sound, and we're going to leave the top end alone. Let's have a listen to that just by itself. Okay, now I'm not making massive decisions here in terms of how much frequency content to take out. In other words, this line here represents 3 decibels of volume drop. So I'm not taking out masses of volume. What I am doing though is contouring twice in this kind of low mids area, finding 2 of the most active frequencies and just pulling them down a little bit. Let's go back to the taiko part above. I'm going to keep these 2 sounds in together now, and we'll have a listen to this first one. Remember, what I want to do here is to retain the really low bottom end, but maybe make a little bit of space in the low mids. So what I've done here is to make sure that this band is a little bit higher actually, but the reason why I've made this narrow is to make sure that the low frequency content, which I like in this sound, is being unattenuated, it's been unaffected up to this slightly higher frequency. Again, we've got this slight dip here just to make room for some of the other sounds as well. Now we already established that this percussion part was working quite nicely. It's not getting in the way, so I'm going to leave that out for now. I'm going to come back to the solo taikos next. And again, what I'm going to do is to open up its EQ. And again, I'm just going to think about this quite resonant frequency, which we've marked here already. Okay, now this frequency, I've taken out quite a lot more volume. And what that's doing is it's getting rid of this resonant sort of overtony hum that we're hearing in that sound. It's the best way to describe it, really. It's almost like the room's just slightly alive as a result of this very prominent low mid-range frequency, which is kind of sucking energy out of the rest of the mix. Let's put these other toms back in, which are providing more high frequency content. And what we'll do is open the mixer as well. And what I'm going to do is to bypass those EQs and then put them all back in. So firstly, what I'll do is I'll just switch them off on all 4 of those sounds, and we'll hear the original, and then we'll put the EQs back in. Now, hopefully what we've still got is all of the drama of the low bass, and we've certainly still got all of the articulation that's coming from the sort of top end and those individual percussive strikes. What we've lost though is this kind of slightly bloated quality in the sort of engine room of the track, this low mid-range. Now, other sounds really can get overwhelming in this area as well. What I'm going to do is to unsolo these percussion parts. I'm going to put in this little bass sequence coming from Zebra, which I've put into this track as well, which by itself sounds like this. Now, the ear is drawn in a sound like this to the top end because the frequency, the cutoff frequency on this sound is opening and closing a little bit. So we're getting a little bit more brightness and a little bit less and a little bit more. We're sort of drawn to the top of it. But right here in the middle of the low mid-range, we've got another really active frequency band, which of course we now know because we've seen the EQs on these sounds is going to be fighting some of that percussion. So again, let's listen through, let's identify that frequency, and let's just pull it in a little bit, and then we'll put it back in with the rest of the parts. Okay, and in context, let's have a listen to that with the drums. Okay, so what we've got again is just this little hole that's being created. Again, not a massive cut, but again, let's just listen to that without any of those EQs in place. Okay, now the last thing to add are the strings. Now what we're going to discover is that on this string part, I've already done quite a lot of EQ work on this individual collection of sounds. I'm using the Vienna Symphonic Library dimension strings here, and you can see that what I've actually done is to go through pretty intensively and find a whole series of nodes where the strings are a bit overwhelming. And to show you what I mean by that, what I'm going to do is to play the string part through by itself. I'm going to take out the EQ and then I'm going to punch it in for the second time round. And let's just have a listen. And this area in particular, these two frequency groups, particularly with the cellos and the double basses and the sort of low end of the strings, become very inflated if we're not careful. So you can see that what I've already done is to identify those bands and make sure that they get reduced. Let's just hear that again, because that's a really startling change. What we're doing is we're setting back kind of all the harshness and we're taking that out. And of course, some of that's coming from the top end and these more bowed frequencies, the sort of slightly brighter things, but you can also hear there's a massive difference in the low end. Again, I'll put it in after 4 bars. Okay, so what we've done is we've effectively addressed low mid-range content in every single sound. We've appraised them all individually, and then what we've done is to make value judgments about which sounds are benefiting from those changes and which ones aren't. So what we're going to do is we're going to have one more listen through. Firstly, what I'm going to do is to take out all of the EQs on all of the sounds, and we'll listen to how the mix sounded without us having addressed low mid-range, and then without talking in between, I promise. What I'll do is to put all those EQs back in and we'll just A/B them so we can hear one and then the other. So in this video, we've looked at the low mid-range. We've discovered that the frequencies within that area are really important. They provide weight, power, determination, drive, all kinds of really useful qualities. But left to their own devices, what we'll discover is that there are loads of sounds that contribute in that frequency area. And as with all frequency areas, as a result, we need to be careful. We need to be making sure that we're making choices about which sounds are lighting that frequency area up and which maybe are clashing, contributing, and pushing that area too hard. Are there sounds within your mix which actually don't need to be active in that area? And what happens when we reduce those a little bit to make room for that really essential frequency group in other sounds?